You attacked Earth first, now we are coming for you. The lights in the auditorium went out at 3:47 in the afternoon. Not the city, not yet, just the auditorium. Someone guessed a blown transformer on the east grid. Nobody ever confirmed it because by the time anyone cared to check, the east grid did not exist anymore. I was in the third row. I had saved my seat with my coat, which was something I had not done since I was 22 years old. But there were 60 parents competing for 70 seats, and I had learned a long time ago that a coat on a chair works on everyone except the kind of person who moves your coat anyway. I was a general. I still saved my seat with my coat. Some habits outlive rank. My daughter Lily was on stage. She was 10 years old. She was dressed as an oak tree. Brown stripe of paint down her left cheek, green construction paper leaves pinned to both arms. She had spent 2 weeks on that costume and had argued seriously with sources that oak trees in autumn should have orange leaves, not green ones. Her teacher had already ordered green paper. Lily had accepted this loss with a kind of quiet dignity that most adults never manage. She was standing perfectly still when the lights went out. The emergency lighting came on 6 seconds later. First thing I saw, Lily, both arms out, completely motionless. Every other child on that stage was shifting, whispering, looking toward the wings, not her. She had decided she was a tree, and she was going to be a tree until someone officially told her otherwise. My phone went off. Then again. Then it did not stop. I stepped into the aisle. I read the screen. I read it a second time, not because I did not understand the words, but because understanding a thing and accepting a thing are two different operations, and my brain was trying to run both at the same time. 7 cities simultaneously. Not military bases, not government buildings, residential areas, schools, hospitals, the most populated neighborhoods in 7 of the largest cities on Earth hit at the same moment. From above by weapons that left no question about where they came from. I looked back at the stage. Lily was looking at me. Not at her teacher, not at the other kids, at me. She had been reading my face her whole life, and whatever she found there, she understood it was serious. I walked to the stage. I took her hands. I told her I had to go. I told her her father was coming. I told her to stay with her teacher and wait. I told her she was the best oak tree I had ever seen in my life. She nodded. She did not cry. I took the paper program from the seat beside me and put it in my left breast pocket. I do not know why. My hand did it without asking. Some things the body decides before the mind gets a vote. I walked out. I did not look back. I have spent 3 years making peace with that. I have not finished. Getting to command post took 40 minutes while the sky over Columbus turned a color I still do not have a word for, not orange, not red. Something between a sunset and a wound. I found a forward post in a repurposed office building 12 miles from the city center. 3 colonels stood around a tactical display like men watching a house burn that they had no idea how to reach. I walked past them and took the screen. Colonel Henry Drake said, "General, you are not authorized for this post." I said, "Whose name is on your chain of command?" He checked. He did not say anything else. The data was clean and cold. Their ship signatures across 7 confirmed positions, atmospheric weapon discharge Patterns, entry vectors on 4. Continents, they had not come from one. Direction, they had come from everywhere. At once, that kind of coordination takes years of planning. They had been planning this for years. 3 months ago, we had no confirmed evidence of intelligent life beyond Earth. There were signals. There were research papers arguing 14 different positions on what those signals meant. People wrote dissertations about it. Then the ships came. Drake and 2 other colonels walked me through the briefing. Weapon types, impact zones estimated. Casualties in the first wave, projected. Secondary targets, I wrote the relevant numbers on the board and underlined the targeting pattern. Civilian first. Not our military, not our satellites. Not our infrastructure, people, the densest concentrations of human life on Earth. A message. Lieutenant Owen Price was in the corner, running signal intercepts, young, sharp eyes. He looked up and said, "What are they trying to tell us?" I said that they can reach us anywhere. He said, "Why?" I said, "Because they want us afraid before they ask for something." I wrote on the board for 3 more minutes. When I turned around, Drake was looking at me differently, not with respect yet, with something careful and measuring, which in my experience is the step that comes just before. Someone handed me a printed casualty coordinate list. Columbus, Ohio, Sector 7, Residential School District. Overlap. I kept reading. My hand did not shake. That is still the thing I think about most when I think about that afternoon. That I finished the briefing, that I kept writing, that my hand did not shake, and I have never fully decided whether that means something good or something broken, or whether there is any difference between the two. I said, "We are not responding. We are beginning." Drake said, "General, those are 2 ways of saying the same thing." I said, "No, they are not." I left the board. I went to find a secure line. Outside the window, the sky had shifted. Again, more orange, something almost familiar about it. Almost like a sunset. Almost. 3 years is a long time. 3 years is also nothing at all when you measure it against what it costs, against the names and the cities and the ground that changed hands so many times it stopped having an owner. 3 years starts to feel like a single long day, a day that began before dawn and never quite decided to end. I am not going to give you the numbers. You already know the numbers. Every human being alive knows the numbers. What I will tell you is that the numbers on their side were worse, and I knew that by the end of year 1, and I did not tell anyone else for 6 more months, because information like that is a drug, and a general who gets drunk on good news stops doing their job. By the end of year 1, we were losing. By the middle of year 2, we were not losing. Those are not the same thing as winning. I want to be clear about that. There is a large amount of space between not losing and winning, and we lived in that space for a very long time, and it was not a comfortable place to be, but it was workable. I have always been better at workable than comfortable. What changed was not our weapons. Our weapons were inferior and stayed inferior for most of the war. What changed was our thinking. I gave a briefing in the second year too. A room of 43 officers, most of them traditional warfare doctrine, most of them trained on models built for fighting other humans. I put one sentence on the board before any of them sat down. The sentence said, "They can outgun us. They cannot outgrieve us." Colonel Henry Drake, who had followed me across 3 postings by that point, read it from the back of the room and said with respect, "General, that is not a strategy, that is a feeling." I said, "It is both, that is the point." The Verk fight to dominate every military doctrine they had ever built. Every engagement pattern we had, cataloged across 2 years of conflict, pointed at the same engine. They moved to control, they pushed until something yielded, and then they occupied the yield. Humans historically do not fight to dominate. Humans fight to not lose. These are different machines. Domination has a ceiling. You push until you own the thing and then you stop pushing. Not losing has no ceiling. Not losing is a direction, not a destination, and you can walk in a direction forever, especially if what is behind you is unacceptable. I showed the room the casualty exchange ratios from the past 18 months. The Verk were winning every single engagement by conventional measurement. Ships destroyed, territory held, tactical objectives achieved. On paper they were ahead. They were also across every recorded action of that period, showing increased signal lag between engagement orders and execution, longer deliberation times before contact, more frequent withdrawal under conditions that did not militarily require it. Fear, operational fear, not in their soldiers, in their commanders. Owen Price, who was now a captain and still had the sharpest eyes in any room, said, "What are they afraid of?" I said, "Us." He said, "We keep losing." I said, "We keep coming back." There is a difference. It took most of the room a while to sit with it. Drake sat with it the fastest. He did not say anything, but he wrote something down, and when Drake wrote something down, it meant he was going to use it, and he did. The moment I knew the war had shifted was not a battle, it was a report. I received it at 3:00 in the morning in my bunk. A single engagement record, forwarded from the 7th Fleet's eastern flank. 1 human destroyer, the Ardent, had been hit by Verk artillery fire during a push near the Kepler perimeter. Propulsion destroyed, 40%. Crew capacity, no ability to maneuver or retreat. By every rule of engagement ever written, the Ardent was finished. You evacuate or you surrender. Those are the options. Those have always been the options. The Ardent crew voted. That is the part that matters. The captain put it to a vote. 40% crew no. Engines surrounded, and they voted to keep firing for 11 hours, not because they could win, not because reinforcements were coming, because they had decided that if the Verk wanted that stretch of space, they were going to have to work for every single second of it. The Verk fleet commander pulled back from a dead ship, a functionally dead ship with no engines, and a fraction of its crew and no strategic value whatsoever, and the Verk fleet commander looked at his display, looked at what those people were doing, and decided he did not want any more of it. I put the report down. I looked at the ceiling of my bunk for a while. Hell of a thing. I started receiving classified Verk intelligence intercepts around the same time. Psychological assessments of human combatants pulled from their command communications. I do not know who found them. I do not know how they were decrypted. My job was to read them, and I read them, and I will tell you that I read every single One of them more than once. The Verk kept using a word in assessment after assessment that translated in 3 different ways depending on context. The closest English rendering, the one my translator settled on after 6 weeks of work, was unreasonable. Not dangerous, not skilled, not effective, unreasonable. They could not build a model for us that held up under contact every projection they built. We violated, not because we were smarter or stronger, but because we kept doing things their model said no rational actor would do. We kept choosing options that cost more than they should. We kept fighting past the point where fighting made sense. We were in their professional military assessment. Unreasonable. I read that word in my bunk at 2:00 in the morning, and I thought about the Arden, and I thought about 40% crew with no engines voting to keep firing for 11 hours, and I thought about Drake writing something down in a briefing room, and I thought about a 10-year-old girl standing perfectly still on a stage with both arms out, still being a tree. Unreasonable. Yes, exactly. Someone slid a new insignia under my door one morning with a note that said, "Only do not die, no sender, no ceremony, no speech. Full general." I pinned it on, made coffee, went back to work. The diplomatic station sat in neutral space between the Kepler perimeter and the Verk frontier, which is a generous way of describing a structure that looked like someone had welded 4 shipping containers together and called it architecture. The Verk had requested the meeting. That was the first thing worth noting. Not a ceasefire, not a prisoner exchange. Diplomatic session with full treaty authority. They had requested it through 3 separate intermediary channels before we responded, which told me they were not confident we would agree. We agreed. I took 2 people with me, Captain Claire Benton, who had been my aide for 14 months and could read a room faster than anyone I had trained, and Neil Saunders, my senior translator, who had devoted the last 2 years of his life to learning a language that, as he once described it, felt like trying to read a book written in architecture. I wore my field uniform. This was a decision I made the night before and did not discuss with anyone. The Verk put enormous cultural weight on presentation, on ceremony, on the visual grammar of formality. Showing up in field dress to a session they had staged with full diplomatic trappings was a message. The message was, I did not come to perform. The Verk diplomat's name was something that took Saunders 4 syllables to approximate, and that I mentally filed under a simpler label. He was tall. They are all tall. He wore a formal garment in deep blue that I later learned was their equivalent of dress whites, which meant he had looked at my field uniform within 30 seconds of my walking through the door and spent the first 20 minutes of the session deciding whether the insult was intentional. It was. He did not ask. He was too careful for that. The room had 1 table, long, pale, smooth, no windows, the kind of room where deals get made that neither side will fully acknowledge afterward. Saunders sat to my left. Benton sat to my right with a recording device and the stillest face I have ever seen on a human being in a high-pressure situation, which is part of why I brought her. The diplomat opened with pleasantries. I let him run through them. Saunders translated in a low voice. I nodded at the appropriate intervals. I was not Listening to the content, I was watching the diplomat's coloring, which shifted. In the Verk, the way voice pitch shifts. In humans, a real-time mood display that they could not fully control, which must be an extraordinary inconvenience in high-stakes negotiations. He was nervous. More than nervous, there was a shade underneath the nervousness that Saunders had described to me once as the Verk equivalent of what a person looks like when they have already calculated a loss and are now working out how to limit it. He had come here knowing he was behind. Good. The formal offer came after 40 minutes of framing. The Verk Empire was prepared to cease all offensive operations, immediately withdraw to pre-war territorial boundaries, enter into binding reparations negotiation, formally recognize Earth's sovereign claim to 12 contested systems. 6 months ago, that offer would have ended the war. The diplomat finished speaking. He sat, his hands flat on the table, which Saunders had told me was their gesture of earnest conclusion. He had offered everything. I looked at him for a long moment. Then I said, "You attacked Earth first." He began to answer. I continued over him, not loudly, not with any edge in my voice, just evenly. The way you continue talking when the other person in the room needs to understand that the talking is not yet done. I want you to understand what that means, not as a legal point, not as a diplomatic position. I want you to understand it the way a body understands a fall. You made a choice. You chose civilian targets. You chose schools and homes and families. You chose to send a message before you even told us you existed. You made that decision, and then you built a war on it. I reached into my left breast pocket. I took out the paper program. It was creased through the middle now, soft at the edges from 3 years in a pocket, the ink slightly smudged on the right side where it had been wet once, a long time ago. I set it on the table between us. The diplomat looked at it. He did not know what it was. He would never know what it was, because I was never going to explain it, because some things are not for explaining, they are for carrying. I looked at him. "Now we are coming for you." He said nothing for 7 seconds. I counted. Then he said through Saunders that the Empire understood the weight of the conflict, that there had been miscalculations, that the original intent had not been to create a prolonged engagement, that the Empire was prepared to be generous in resolution. I said, the Empire is prepared to be generous because the Empire is no longer winning. Those are different things. Another shift in his coloring, darker at the collar. Saunders wrote something on his notepad and slid it to me without looking up. It read, "That shade means they agree with you and they do not want to." The diplomat leaned forward, lower. "Register now, a private channel, or as private as a formal session gets." He said through Saunders that he understood I had personal losses in this conflict, that the Empire acknowledged the civilian toll of the initial strike as a regrettable strategic miscalculation, that if there was a personal element to my position, the Empire was willing to address it. I looked at him for a while. I said, "I do not have a personal element, I have a professional one. My profession is finishing what you started." He offered a back channel, a real deal. 1-to-1, away from the formal session. What would it actually take? What was I actually willing to accept? I picked up the program from the table, put it back in my pocket. I said I will sleep when the math works out. I stood up. Benton stood. Saunders stood and closed his notepad. We left in the transport back to the fleet. Benton sat across from me and said, "Nothing for a long time she was good at that." Then she said he was frightened. I said yes. She said, "Is that what you wanted?" I thought about it. The question deserved an honest answer. I said I wanted him to understand who he was dealing with. Frightened is a reasonable response to that. She looked out the window at the stars. She said, "What is in the program?" I said nothing. She did not ask again. That night I filed my operational report and marked the session as non-productive, which was technically accurate. No agreement had been reached. No terms had been exchanged. No deal had been made. But when I read Saunders' full translation notes before I went to sleep, there was a line at the end of his section on the diplomat's behavioral indicators. He had written it in small letters, almost like a footnote. It read, "I do not think they expected us to say no." I read that line twice, put the notes down, turned off the light. Crossing the boundary line the Verk had drawn on day one of the war was not the dramatic moment people later made it into. It was 4:00 in the morning ship time. I was on the bridge of the Galloway, which was our flagship at that point. Ship that had been built in 18 months in an orbital yard above Iceland by a crew that worked in rotating shifts around the clock because they had all agreed, without being asked, to not stop until it was done. I had toured the yard once during construction. The walls near the main assembly corridor were covered in names that workers had written in marker, hundreds of them, which was not authorized in, which I did not report. We crossed the boundary at 4:00 in the morning. I was in the morning. I was standing at the forward display. Captain Owen Price, now commanding the Galloway, stood beside me. Neither of us said anything while it happened. On the tactical display, the marker line moved behind us. The stars looked exactly the same on both sides. I had expected something, some shift in the light or the instruments or the feel of the ship, something to mark the moment. There was nothing. Space does not care about the lines we draw in it. Space does not care about much. That is one of the things I have come to appreciate about space. What I can tell you about the fleet that crossed that line is this: we had built it in 3 years. Every orbital fabrication facility on Earth had been converted or expanded. 14 allied species, all of whom had previous encounters with the Vuric Empire that they were glad to discuss in detail once humanity came knocking with the right questions and the right intentions, had contributed materials and design intelligence, and in several cases their own ships. The result was something no single person had designed and no single government had authorized. It had come into being the way many large and necessary things do, gradually and then all at once. Price said quietly, "There is a Vuric defense fleet reading on long-range sensors, heavy formation, 12 capital ships in support." I said, "Projected engagement window?" He said, 4 hours, give or take. I said, "Tell the fleet full readiness." The next 3 hours were the kind that stretch. Every minute of preparation takes on extra weight when what is coming is real. I walked the bridge. I read reports. I drank 2 cups of coffee, which is one more than I usually Allow myself before an engagement. Because the second one makes my hands less precise, but I had been awake for 19 hours and a judgment call. At the 2-hour mark, Price came to me with updated sensor data. The Verk formation was holding position, not advancing, holding. At 90 minutes, it was still holding. At 1 hour, I was standing at the display watching it when Price said, in a tone that had no precedent in his voice in the 4 years I had known him, "General, they are moving." I looked at the display. They were moving away. 12 capital ships in full support, the core space defense fleet of the Verk Empire, the fleet that was supposed to hold the line at their own border, was pulling away from us on a withdrawal vector. Not a tactical repositioning, not a flanking maneuver, a straight clean retreat. I stood at the display for 11 seconds. I know it was 11 because Price told me later that he counted because he had nothing else to do with his hands. Hell of a thing. I said, continue approach vector full fleet, no deceleration. Price said, should we signal them, ask for their intentions? I said, their intentions are on the display. He looked at the retreating formation. He nodded. He did not ask again. There was a message waiting in my personal queue that evening, flagged 3 days prior, auto-delivered at the queue's scheduled daily clearance. Personal sender, not military. Paul, my ex-husband, we had not spoken in 8 months, which was not a record. I looked at the flag on the message for a while before I opened it. He was well. The kids were okay. He had remarried 6 months ago, a woman named Ellen who was a librarian and who was, according to Paul, very kind, which was a word he used a lot and which I had always suspected said more about what he needed than about the person he was describing. The kids, plural. Ellen's son was 9. His name was Freddie and he liked trains, apparently, which Paul seemed to find endearing in a way that made his whole message sound lighter than any message from Paul had sounded in a very long time. I read it twice. I turned my chair to face the wall. 3 seconds. Then I turned back. I filed a response, 3 sentences. I said I was glad he was well. I said I was glad the kids were okay. I said take care of yourself, Paul, in exactly those words because they were the truest thing I had in that moment, and I was too tired for anything more complicated. I sent it. I went back to work. The following morning we received a broadcast across all frequencies from Verk Command. Saunders spent 2 hours on the translation, came back to me pale in a way that I had not seen from him before, and set the transcript on my desk. Without speaking, I read it. There is no perfect English translation. For the Verk word they used, Saunders had given 4 possible renderings: mercy, quarter, ceasefire, and finally, at the bottom, the one he had circled, please. The Verk Empire was broadcasting the word please on every frequency they could reach across every channel we monitored, like a lighthouse sending a signal into a storm. I read the transcript. I set it down. I noted it in the operational log. I gave the order to continue. The Verk homeworld had rings. I did not know that until I saw it from orbit. It is not in any of the intelligence files we assembled during the war. No probe had gotten close enough, or if it had, the data had been lost in the first year. So when the Galloway came into orbital range, and I saw them on the forward display, pale and wide and catching the light of the system sun. I was not prepared. I stood at the display longer than I needed to. Price noticed. He did not say anything, which is one of the things I have always respected about him. The rings were beautiful. That is a strange thing to think about. A place you have spent 3 years working toward ending, that's something about it is beautiful, but the universe does not check your operational objectives before arranging itself. The rings were there and they were beautiful, and I registered it, and then I went back to work because that is the only thing I know how to do when something surprises me. The Verk Defense Command had gone dark 2 days earlier. No fleet presence, no signal traffic on military frequencies. The retreat that had begun at their border had continued all the way back to the home world, and what greeted us in orbit was not an armada, but silence. I did not trust the silence. I told Price to hold position, full sensors, full defensive posture, full readiness. We were not moving until I understood what the silence meant. It took 6 hours. Then a single transmission came through. On the diplomatic frequency, formal encoding, maximum priority. The Verk Emperor wanted to speak with me directly. Not my government, not a council, not an intermediary. Me. I took the call in my quarters. This was not a power move. I took it in my quarters because I did not want 40 people on the bridge watching my face. For the next hour, some negotiations happen in front of an audience. This one was not going to. Price set up the secure channel. Saunders sat with me. I told him to translate everything, every word, every pause he could read, into the vocal patterns. I wanted the full picture. The Emperor appeared on screen. He was old. I say that having seen perhaps a dozen Verk individuals in person and perhaps 100 in visual recordings. An age in the Verk reads differently than it does in humans, but there was something in his bearing and the way he held the weight of himself that I recognized. I had seen it in soldiers who had been in too many engagements over too many years, a kind of settled heaviness, not defeat. Something older than defeat. He spoke for a long time. The terms were everything, complete cessation of hostilities, full withdrawal from all contested and occupied systems, reparations without ceiling or time limit, formal acknowledgement of Earth's sovereign rights to any system within 400 light years, a permanent open diplomatic channel, war crimes proceedings against the commanders who had designed the civilian targeting doctrine of the first strike. Everything. He was offering everything. I listened to all of it. Saunders translated in a low, steady voice. I watched the Emperor's coloring the whole time, not anxious, not the cold calculation of the diplomat on the station, something else, something I had not seen in a Verk before. Saunders wrote a word on his notepad and held it up without interrupting the translation. Exhaustion. I nodded. The Emperor finished. He set his hands flat on the surface in front of him, the earnest conclusion gesture, and then added something that was not in any diplomatic script. He said through Saunders, "We did not know what you were." The room was quiet. I looked at the Emperor on screen. I thought about the Arden. I thought about 14 allied species who had opened their doors with both hands when humanity knocked. I thought about a school auditorium with green construction paper Leaves, I thought about 3 seconds facing. A wall on a transport ship. I thought about the word unreasonable in a VERK psychological assessment that I had read 17 times in a bunk at 2:00 in the morning. I said, yes, you did, you just thought it would stop you. Saunders translated, the Emperor received it, his coloring moved through 2 shades that I did not have names for. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we thought all things could be stopped. I said, most things can. He said, not humans. I thought about that. I wanted to give him an honest answer because he had come to this call with honesty, and I respected it even in an enemy, maybe. Especially in an enemy. I said, most things can stop us too. Grief does not. That is the only thing that is different about us. We grieve. And we keep going anyway. You cannot build a model for that because it does not behave like a strategy. It is not a strategy, it is just what we do. Saunders translated, the Emperor was still for a long time. Then he bowed his head. I accepted the surrender. The formalities took 3 more hours. Price managed the technical transmission of the agreement. The allied species representatives were brought in for the signing phase. My government was patched in from Earth. There were speeches, which I did not listen to closely, because the work was done, and speeches are for the people who need a ceremony to mark what has already happened. I went back to my quarters when it was over. I sat down. I'd been moving for 3 years at the pace a war requires, which is a pace that does not leave room for anything that is not the next task and the task after that. Now the next task was not coming. Now there was nothing on my immediate operational list. Now there was just the room and the hum of the ship and the vacuum world on the display outside my window with its pale rings catching light. I had been writing something for 6 months. Not a report, not an operational document, a letter. I had started it the night after Paul's message, and I had picked it up and put it down so many times across so many briefings and engagements and sleepless transit routes that the paper was soft at the corners from handling. I took it out. I finished it. It was not a long letter. I do not write long letters. I write the way I brief. What needs to be said, nothing extra, no decoration, but this was harder than any briefing I had ever given, because briefings are for delivering information, and this letter was not about information. This letter was about something I did not have a professional vocabulary for. I wrote to Lily. Not the Lily that was gone. I know the difference, but there are some debts you pay whether or not anyone is left to receive them. There are some things you say because you need them said, because carrying them unsaid is its own kind of weight, and I had been carrying it since 3:47 on an afternoon 3 years ago, when the lights went out and I walked away without looking back. I wrote about the program in my pocket. I wrote about why I kept it. I wrote about what it meant to stand in front of 43 officers and say they cannot grieve us, and mean it as a military doctrine, and also mean it as the only true thing I knew. I wrote about what it means to fight for something that is already gone, how fighting for it is not the same as pretending it is not gone, how the two things live together in a person without resolving, like 2 weather systems occupying the same sky, and you do not wait for the weather to settle, you just navigate. I wrote about the rings. I wrote that I had not expected them to be beautiful, that beauty had surprised me at the end of something terrible, that I was choosing to take that as a good sign, which is not a calculation I would have made 3 years ago, which means something has changed in me and I am still figuring out if I am glad about that or not. I folded the letter. I held it. There was no address for it, that was all right. I had known that when I started writing it. Some letters are not for sending, some letters are for the person who writes them so that they can put something down that they have been carrying too long, so that the carrying becomes a choice instead of a habit. I put the letter in my left breast pocket next to the program. The two papers sat there together the way they had been sitting together in my head for 3 years, the loss and the reason, the before and the after, the tree costume and the war. I turned off the light. Outside the window, the rings of the Varric home world caught the light of a distant sun, pale and wide and completely indifferent to what had just ended below them. Space did not know a war was over. Space did not know a war had begun. Space just kept being space, which was, all things considered, exactly what I needed from it right now. I closed my eyes. I will sleep now. For the first time in 3 years, the math had worked out. I was going to sleep.